Hello, everyone.
How's everybody doing today?
I'm doing well.
All right. Well, why don't you tell people who you are, Josh?
I'm Josh Maltby. I work with Goblins and Growlers. We are a Richmond, Virginia-based D&D event company. So you can imagine that things are not super great for us right now.
At least not super busy. Things are super great, but they're not super busy.
That's true. Things could be significantly worse than we are. So we are blessed for that. We are trying to figure out, how to do things when there's not a whole lot of physical contact allowed. And some of what we've been doing is figuring out some more about podcasting, Twitch streaming, and various and other sundry ways in which we can all be in contact without being in contact. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Brandon.
I am Brandon Dingus, and I am with Goblins and Growlers in Richmond, Virginia as well. I tend to focus a lot on doing sort of writing, editing, and planning for a lot of our content. Josh is sort of my writing partner on a lot of that stuff. He handles a lot of our event organization for the games that we're usually doing, but not currently doing. So really, Josh is just using this as a huge excuse to be lazy. And I guess relevant to our panels, in our actual play 5e podcast, I play over the hill pro wrestler, triple multi-classer Gravy Boat Barnes.
Oh, that's fair. I also play a character in our actual play podcasts, the half-elf rogue Solinar Vacus, who had not been meant to be a bit of an edgelord, but wound up being a bit of an edgelord anyway. I think maybe that's just half-elf rogues for you.
Or Josh Maltby.
Maybe.
Yeah. So I think we're going to start. We've got two panels scheduled. We've got actual play podcasting and Monstercraft. And I think we're going to start with actual play podcasting.
Excellent. So you sent me a few notes on this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want me to kind of address things and then you speak about them?
Yeah. Why don't you moderate?
Okay.
Yeah.
So to start out with, let's talk about the thing that everyone needs to have before they start doing any recording, which is equipment. How do you go about getting those, and what should you be focusing on?
Well, I mean, for the people aspect, hopefully that's something that's sort of taken care of itself. You've got a dedicated group of people who are able to commit to playing regularly, and also I don't want to use the phrase good enough, but that's what I'm going to say. Good enough to be in like something that will be consumed by other people.
How about comfortable?
Comfortable is a good word. That's a much nicer word than where I was going with that. I'm going to adjust my camera really quick too. So you definitely want to have a player base that is going to be comfortable being on screen or on audio, comfortable receiving feedback after things have sort of gone out into the world. I know for us, like, I guess maybe a good way to start this is just sort of tell our story about how we got our podcast started. About 2 years ago, we started this business and started running games around Richmond, Virginia. And we started thinking about ways that we could market that and maybe grow our audience outside of Richmond. And the easiest way to do that, it seemed like, was for us to start a D&D podcast. There's tons of D&D podcasts out there. So parentheses, whenever you start one, it's going to be difficult to break through. But it can be a very rewarding creative endeavor, and it's brought a lot of eyes and ears to us that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten. So we, Alon, one of our other business partners, he and I got a beer one day and just sat down and started talking about how we're going to do this, what are we going to do? And we just started making some loose plans. We started recording at his dinner table in his old apartment, which was not a really great setup. And we'll talk about those kind of things in a minute. We found a DM who was super eager to do this for us. And that also sort of worked itself out as a business partnership for us. We recorded our pilot episode like 3 or 4 times. And then we finally started releasing it. We now have a studio space, a dedicated space for this. That we use to record and do various other things. So it's been like a year and a half since we started the podcast almost.
That sounds about right. I think we started releasing episodes December of 2017.
Yeah, so we're coming up on 18 months, but we've got more than 10,000 downloads right now and more than 50 some episodes.
Yeah, which is really cool. Now, regarding equipment, what equipment is most important when looking at a podcasting setup?
A decent microphone. Like, you don't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on all your audio setup, but everybody needs to have a decent mic. You're not going to be able to put out something that's got quality enough that people are going to want to sit and listen to it if you're just talking into your webcam mic that's built into your laptop. You can see here, I'm using actually right now one of the microphones that we use to record the podcast. These are, fairly decent quality mics. Like, these aren't like top of the line, but they're certainly not bottom of the barrel either. They do a great job. They give us really clear audio. In addition to using them for our podcasts, we use them for streaming, and I also use it to record the bonus podcasts that we have available on our Patreon. It's very hard to get bad quality audio with these. And I think that really needs to be sort of your first priority, getting your equipment set up in such a way that you can get clear audio. Because if you don't have clear audio, nobody's going to want to listen to it. Everything else can, we actually have a sound engineer who works for us on ours, but all of that is secondary. You can tell a story that people want to listen to and get them engaged just by having just clear audio that they can sit and listen to without having to strain while they're driving, trying to understand what you're saying because there's hiss, or you're not close enough to the mic, or it's just not picking it up properly. So clear audio is probably number 1, 2, and 3 of the top 10 things that you have to take care of. And just get some, start out with some, inexpensive dedicated microphones and go from there. You don't have to start out buying something fantastic. You can grow incrementally in that way, but just start with something that's not a built-in microphone.
Yeah, confession for our own podcast is that we are currently running on a 4-channel system, even though we have 5 performers.
Yeah, because we have
two people share a mic on every single recording we ever do.
Yeah, because we have a 4-channel mixer, and it would be great if we got another microphone. But if we got another microphone, we'd still have a 4-channel mixer.
Exactly. And which, by the way, makes life a little bit harder for whoever's going to be editing your podcast.
Yeah.
If it's only going to cost you a little bit more to get a decent, if you've got a cast of 5, to get a decent 6-channel, because I don't think 5-channel mixers are a thing.
Right.
Then spend that little bit of extra money to save your editor hours. And I do mean hours on a regular basis mixing these episodes.
Yeah. And, like I said, my sort of sound editing experience is simply from doing our bonus Patreon podcasts. But I'll tell you right now, if it weren't for having multiple channels set up for all those recordings, I would hate doing that. I would absolutely hate it. It just makes it so much easier to have everything separated out.
It's so much easier to mix things. I think that pretty well covers the basics of equipment for actual play podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, if there were a part 2 to this, like an advanced class for this, then we would start talking about mixers and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. And maybe even specific models of things that you should be looking out for. But basically the idea is get yourself a decent microphone, nothing crazy expensive, and try to get enough mixer that you've got a channel for each of your performers, whether that's 4 or 5 or 6.
Yeah. I suppose another thing we could talk about sort of related to that is recording platform. And you've got a couple of options there. I know this wasn't in the notes that I sent you, but I literally just thought of this. Mainly because it's connected to my struggles, like in the minutes before we went live, trying to make sure we were getting all this recorded. But you've got a couple options there. If you wanted to play through Roll20, you could do it that way and maybe record the window for that. Or you could use Open Broadcast Studio, which is a free software suite that is kind of sort of an industry standard for a lot of streamers. If you've never heard of it before, it's really easy to figure out. You can download it for free. You can set up your different audio and video inputs. set up an overlay, like if you were doing a Twitch stream or something like that. It's pretty easy to figure out. I always tell people, like, if you just spend 30 minutes hitting it with a rock, you're eventually going to figure out how it works. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of great tutorials out there. So Open Broadcast Studio, or OBS, is a fantastic option if you don't have some sort of professional recording suite software.
And kind of in that vein, when you're starting to look at your platform that you're going to be releasing these episodes from, there are a lot of really great platforms for releasing podcasts on. Just make sure that you've got something. If you're already familiar with how a certain variety of website structure works, just make sure that you're picking something that works well with that variety of website structure. So speaking of where to put your podcast, what are your thoughts on recording? Where do you go and record? Do you do that in like someone's kitchen? Do you buy a small warehouse so that you can line it all with soundproof material?
Yeah. We went through some growing pains on that because, like I mentioned at the top, we started out recording in Alon's dining room, which was actually a small section of Alon's living room in the very open plan front half of his old apartment. It was a rickety table that did not have enough space for all of us, and there were barely enough outlets to get everything plugged in that we needed to without having a bunch of outlets hanging or a bunch of extension cords. It kind of sucked because, like I mentioned earlier, we recorded our pilot a couple of times, so it was a couple of times having to go back to his apartment, tear up his dining room, clamp mics to the table, try to get everybody situated. And that, after that experience, that's what really got me thinking about us needing some sort of dedicated space to do this. So I started poking around trying to find some sort of office or studio space for us. And we ended up getting kind of lucky, and we found an open studio space that is not terribly expensive in an art gallery. And believe it or not, they let us rent. Like I was worried that it would be like a juried thing, and they'd be like, "Oh, well, we're going to have to see your work and all this stuff." They're like, "No, just cut us a check. We're good." They're great. They've been great hosts for us. We really love the studio space, but the benefit of it is we have a table set up in here, and we can set up the mics, and for the most part, just leave them set up. We're comfortable with it. Everybody sort of knows where they sit. We've got assigned seating. We don't have anything in the way of soundproofing. We have 2 cinder block walls in here and then 2 drywall walls, but we also have, our own door and everything. So we tend not to get too much interference from outside noise. Occasionally a train will go by and we'll have to stop talking, or there'll be some sort of police action occurring not too far from us, and we'll have to stop for a few minutes. And we always have to shut off the AC or the heater for our area of the gallery while we're recording. But I don't think you need to do anything like super invasive. If, like, let's say you decide you're going to do this in like a spare bedroom at your house, you're like, well, I don't use that room, so I can make it a dedicated space for this recording. I don't think you're going to need to be putting up all kinds of stuff on the walls. You might want to, depending, if you've got small children or animals that are making a lot of noise, you may want to put some sort of sound deadening thing up there. But as long as you got solid mics and you're not trying to talk over police sirens going on outside, I think you're going to be okay.
Basically, it's if you have the more dedicated space you can have, and the further away from things like road noise it is, the less editing things out that your sound engineer will have to do, which they're already going to be spending several hours per hour of podcast you release doing editing.
Well, and let's be clear about this. If you're just starting an actual play podcast, your sound engineer is going to be you, because nobody else is going to have the buy-in to do that kind of work.
It's true. So let's talk a little bit about, you talked early about how you want a group of people who are going to be comfortable with this. Mm-hmm. But let's talk a little bit about how those people are going to need to be committed as well.
Right. Go ahead.
Both their time and to their character.
Right. Let's talk about time first. Nothing is going to kill your podcast faster than not having regular episode releases. People will immediately forget about you. You will fall off the top of their mind. they'll delete you from their podcast feeds after 4 or 5 weeks of not seeing anything from you. So you have to have people who are dedicated, and because if you're if you, the person who's decided to start this podcast, is sort of the prime mover here, you're going to be the editor, you're going to be the producer, you're probably going to be the DM. But you have to look at it from a producer aspect too. You have to make sure your people are there on a regular schedule to record, and you have to make sure that you are doing the editing in a sustainable way so you can maintain your release schedule. And that's kind of up to you to decide what works for you. Will you be able to reliably release 1 episode a month? Because if you say yes to that, that's better than saying, I'm going to be able to release, 2 episodes a month, but every once in a while you miss that. Like, don't say you're going to make a weekly podcast if you don't know that you have the time and energy to be able to do the recording and editing to hit those weekly release schedules.
That's tricky.
Yeah.
And it's also worth noting that you need to make time, not just for the recording itself, but for breaks in between episodes, for warming up beforehand, and for discussing how things went after the fact. So it's not just, if you're going to record 3 hours of podcast, you're not going to be in the studio for 3 hours. You're probably going to be in the studio for closer to 4.5 or 5.
Yeah, that's what usually happens with us. We record twice a month, every other Tuesday, usually from about 7:30 until 11:30. And you also have to factor in time for goofing around, because nobody's going to be entirely like on point for the entire time. So you have to build in a little stress release time for that kind of thing. But when you're talking to people about wanting to be involved in your podcast, make sure they understand what the time commitment is, because you don't want to get somebody involved and then after a couple months they're like, hey, I really just don't have the time to do this. I mean, I have listened to so many podcasts that have started out really promising, and then they just sort of like peter out because people couldn't get together to record. People wouldn't make the time to do it. It's a commitment. You got to look at it like a job. It's not just like especially if you want it to be successful and people to discover it, like people who aren't connected to you in any way, you want them to be able to discover it. You have to treat it like a job and not a hobby.
Yeah. Which I think kind of brings us over to the commitment to character of, who are you going to be in this podcast, and how dedicated do you need to be to that role?
Yeah. And the answer to your second question is very, because characters are what are memorable. The story is going to be memorable, but people are going to keep returning for the characters. That's why on the front end, before any recording even starts, you need to sit down with all your players, do like your session 0 for your podcast, and not necessarily like have them tell you what they want the character to be, but have a discussion with them about like what you're looking for and what the tone of your podcast is going to be. What kind of story are you looking to tell, and what sort of archetype is this character going to fill in that story? Like my character, for example, he's sort of I'm guilty of not following my own advice when we started our podcast, because we've learned a lot just over the last year and a half. But my character has sort of fallen into, and Josh, tell me if you think I'm misreading this, but he's sort of fallen into the archetype of like irritated dad or something.
He's very like patriarchal and curmudgeonly, which I don't know where he gets that from, Brandon. It's a mystery. I don't know where that might have come from.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know at all. But yeah, he's an over the hill professional wrestler. He is at one time he was a 2-time world champion. I guess he still is a 2-time world champion. He's just not holding any belts right now. But he was on the downswing of his career, so he just started to go out and try to adventure a little bit to try to sort of find himself. He's also a raging libertarian, and I do my best to make him sound like Billy D. Williams, which has varying levels of success.
And also mixed responses from people who know you.
Yeah, exactly. Like I have real life friends who refuse to let me do the voice in their presence because they're just like, that's just disgusting and I don't want to hear it. He's also a huge flirt. But you have to be able to create a character with multiple dimensions. Like my character needed to be, I didn't want my character just to be the wrestler. So that's why I sort of started making him a very like pro individual liberty, personal responsibility kind of libertarian, because that added a little bit of something else for him to react to and be.
All right, so we've got about 9 minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk real quick about promotion and your social media presence.
Yeah, and this goes back to what I was talking about you have to treat it like a job, especially like nobody's going to become the Adventure Zone just by recording an hour of audio and then putting it out into the universe twice a month. Like, we are lucky because before we started the podcast, through our events and things, we had already built a small but fairly dedicated audience. So that was a really good seed for us to grow a wider audience, because you have friends recommending to friends, and you get a lot of organic publicity from that, but you just can't rest on that. So, we have a Facebook page for our events business, and our events business / our content business, because we also write original adventure content and things like that. But we ended up starting separate social media profiles just for our podcast. And while we're talking about the podcast, I really want to make sure we don't forget this, but we produce and perform that in partnership with a local comic book store, Alpha Comics and Games. It's a women-owned comic book store in Richmond, Virginia, located at the Willow Lawn Shopping Center, alphacomics.com. Call them. They can fulfill online orders. And if you're in the Richmond area, they can do curbside pickup right now while all this stuff is going on. But I lost my train of thought. Oh, we were talking about social media presence. Yeah, we were talking about social media presence. So they have their own social media for their business, so they reshare everything we do. Building partnerships is really good for this. Like, find other people who are popular and doing things and find ways to work with them so they can be like, hey, this person that we work with is really cool, our audience. So why don't you give them a listen? You can't just rest on once a week or whenever your release schedule is doing a social media post on like Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Like, hey, the new episode's out. You have to engage. I created a Facebook page for my character, and I'll admit that I don't use it as much as possible, but I still get alerts that like people have viewed it and people are liking it. And I'll make posts there occasionally. I should really do more about that, but I also have to work a full-time job in addition to the Goblins and Growlers stuff. So find ways to create more social media tendrils for whatever you're doing. Run contests. Like we have button merch for our G&G stuff, but we also have merchandise specifically for our Quid Pro Roll podcast stuff, and you can do giveaways with that kind of thing. We've done a live show for a Quid Pro Roll. We sold out a deli, which doesn't sound very impressive, but it's actually a very large deli, and we maxed out their capacity.
We expected to have something in the realm of 40 people.
Yeah, we had 60 some.
Yeah, we had over 60 people in attendance, which was crazy.
Yeah, so we cosplayed our characters, did the live show. It was very successful. It brought us more new eyes, and in a number of ways, it was a very beneficial thing for us to do. And once everything sort of settles down in terms of public gatherings, we're planning on doing another one of those. So find ways to build interest in your podcast through social media, through events, things like that, through partnerships. And again, treat it like a job. If we had to give a subtitle to this part of the panels, it would be like turning your D&D game into an actual play podcast, treat it like a job.
All right. So we've got about 5 minutes left on actual play podcasting. So let's talk real quick about hosting, and then we'll get into merchandise potentials.
Yeah. We can do hosting really quick. We host ours, and this is not, I'm not trying to steer people one way or another. You do your research, figure out what works best for you. We host ours on Podbean. It's very simple. It's inexpensive, and it has a good built-in platform for finding metrics. And that's another thing. Like, if you go to Podbean, it's good because you've got, like, I can at least speak to being familiar with the metrics that they have on their dashboard there. You need to be able to figure out where your downloads are coming from, when you're hitting peaks, what your trends are looking like. Because you can't have success without having the data to tell you what you need to do better or what you need to double down on because it's already working well. There are ways you can do hosting for free. Like, I know a lot of, not necessarily a lot, but some podcasters have found a way to do their hosting on archive.org for free. I wouldn't recommend that. If you want to do it for reals, pay the, $10 a month for your hosting. If that's, the mics will be an upfront capital cost, but after that, really your only monthly expense for doing this should be $10 a month or so for hosting.
Yeah. So let's move over into merchandise possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Be shameless. Be shameless. If you've got a catchphrase that's catching on, make a button out of it. If you've got a logo, make a t-shirt out of it. You can look at Josh right there. He's repping the QPR t-shirt.
Yes. Check out this t-shirt.
Mm-hmm. You can very simply make designs and put them up on a place like Cafe Press or Zazzle or something like that. So they'll do drop shipping. Your profit margin won't be super high, but it'll be more awareness of your brand. Don't try to come up with all kinds of stupid stuff. Make sure it's natural. But really, the opportunities are kind of limitless there, especially if you're not putting money up front for all your merchandise. We do that for some of our things just because it's a better deal to pay lower per item and then turn around and sell it. But you can certainly do like drop shipping, like Zazzle or Cafe Press. Make a few bucks per shirt that you wouldn't have made otherwise, and you'll know that people are out there wearing your stuff.
Well, for us, it wasn't just about, making things inexpensive. We also almost exclusively get our merchandise from local t-shirt printers,
Mm-hmm.
Local paper presses, things like that, as much as we can. Yeah. Where it's cost effective.
And I would certainly encourage people to do that when possible. We have the benefit of having like another business to help support the podcast. So other people may just need to go for cheapest option if they're trying to get something off the ground.
Oh, absolutely. All right. So we've got a couple minutes left. Is there anything that you thought of while we were kind of going through here that you want to add on kind of on the tail end here?
Not really, other than just doubling down on the idea that this is if you do this and you're going to do it well, it's going to be a job. You have to be the driving force to encourage people and convince them to come out and do this on a regular schedule with you. You have to be the editor. You have to be the producer. Have like 4 or 5 episodes in the can before you start releasing anything. And when you do start releasing things, don't just release 1 episode, release 2. Because that way, if people like it, they'll immediately have something else to listen to. And that'll keep them on the hook for the next release.
So really what you're saying is produce 7 episodes, release 2 of them so that you've got 5 in the back pocket for when something inevitably goes awry.
Yeah. Like how many episodes do we have in the can right now?
Produced?
No, just raw audio.
Oh, raw audio. We've got, I think 5, which is because we haven't been able to record lately.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's hoping to figure that out soon.
Normally we have like 8 or 9 of raw audio. That we're just waiting to edit.
There was a point where I think we were sitting on like 12 or 14.
That was crazy. That was crazy. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's sort of our how to get your actual play podcast off the ground. If you have any more questions, please shoot us a message. You can find us on Facebook or contact at goblinsandgrowlers.com. Search for Goblins and Growlers or Quid Pro Roll. Find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all that stuff. And, we'll be happy to help you however we can if you've got a question that maybe we didn't address here or something that you wanted to dive in a little deeper on, or if you just want to tell us we're wrong, that's cool too.
And good news, at the end of my presentation, Alon was so kind as to give me a splash page that has all of our social media and websites and things like that on it.
Oh, fantastic.
To make all of this very easy for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go ahead and share up my screen.
Okay.
Because
as we transition into the second panel,
you're talking about the actual play podcasting. I'm talking about becoming a master monster crafter.
Bom, bom, bom. And let's give a quick shout out to Feral Fox. There are artists that work with us, and they design all the artwork for anything that we come up with pretty much. And they made this design.
I think of us, you are our most artistic person, Brandon. And I know for a fact that it would take you a very long time to come up with anything this pretty.
And I could never execute it either. I'm like a very poor digital artist.
All right. So starting off at the top, I've got 5 steps to how we get this done. A quick reminder that we are Goblins and Growlers, just in case you're tuning in kind of at the halfway mark to check out Monstercrafting. We do event hosting for Building Inclusive Community here in Richmond, Virginia. And we've got a ton of professional DMs that we exclusively work with local businesses, places like Alpha Comics and Games for when we're trying to send people to pick up their books. We've got a couple of breweries around town that we support by hosting events there. And, it's a great way to kind of expand yourself out into the community and take D&D from being something that you do at home with your close circuit of friends to being something even more social and even more public.
Mm-hmm.
So I have, for crafting any monster I do.
Yeah. And let me, before you do that, let me just just set this up. Josh is sort of the primary monster crafter that we have. We do, for our Patreon, we do monthly rewards of original monster blocks, and Josh is the one who always comes up with those. Sometimes I'll be like, hey, I have this idea for X, and he'll be like, yes, I will take that and make it better. So he's definitely the expert among us on that thing.
I do tend to do some of my best work off of the crazed concept someone else has brought me. So I've got 5 real steps for that. You've got to craft the concept, design the space, design the fight, be ready to kill your darlings, and then at the end of everything, be ready to accept critique. So we'll start off at the top with inventing the concept. So there's a few different ways you can come up with a concept for a monster. One of those is to come up with a whole cloth. This is probably the rarest of anything I've ever seen. This is where someone's like, what if we took a sound monster, but we made it some kind of like underground elemental creature so that it creates earthquakes? What if that was a thing? I know for a fact that a few of us have pulled things out of dreams before. At least one of my creatures has been out of something that I dreamed, and then I was like, that'd be great for D&D. And of course, the most common is where you take someone else's idea that you saw like in a book or on a movie or on a TV show, and you kind of twist it to make it your own and also to make it something that fits well in your universe. And
I notice on your slide, it says steel, and you are rewording it as you're talking.
Well, it's steel. Steel is the simple phrase for that. Mm-hmm. Steel is exactly what you're going to be doing, but you're going to make it your own because
you're going to be inspired by, not steel, based on a true story written by so and so.
Basically, because if you steal it outright, then you might get into copyright problems, and that's no fun for anybody. Mm-hmm. So while you're figuring out kind of what this monster is going to be like, it's important to figure out how this monster is going to fit into your game world. I have several concepts that I have not yet started working on because I have nowhere for them to go. I have nothing for them to do when they get there. So for me, it's really important to know where it's going to go because then I know what to focus on and kind of what my deadline is for having that creature ready so that my party isn't facing a thug out of page 363 in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Because we've all been there. We've all done that, myself included. Probably the most important, but also kind of the last thing that you do while you're coming up with your concept is you determine, much as you would in the game of Clue, where, when, and how it will be dying, and maybe even who will be killing it. So, if this is something that you want your party to take down, you need to know that as you're designing it, because then it needs to be something that is going to be capable of being taken down by your party. Whether that's going to be a difficult encounter or not is, really up to you. That brings us into our next step, designing the space. So we all know a lot about sports, being huge nerds. So we all know that when you're on your home field, you actually have an advantage because that's where you do all of your practicing. Those are the weather conditions in which you are most familiar. And then on top of that, you're most likely to have people cheering you on. The same is true for monsters. There are advantages and disadvantages that a monster might have when they are in their own territory versus someone else's. The illustration of the giant ant that we did for a one-page dungeon is really perfect here, because an ant inside its own lair could be incredibly dangerous.
Let's be clear. That was not a giant ant. The whole party was shrunk down. It was a regular sized ant.
It's all in perspective, right? Regular for people who hadn't been shrunk all the way down.
Right.
So in an ant's lair, an ant is significantly more dangerous than if you, say, encountered a giant ant in the middle of the ocean. There's a lot of things that an ant can do inside an anthill that it's not going to be able to do in some other places, or that it won't be able to do as well. Additionally, you might have things like the monster might have familiarity with the territory, which makes it better able to maneuver through that territory for running fights. That's where we get into the encounter elements. So you've got two categories of encounter elements. You've got active and you've got passive. An active encounter element would be something like an ability that your monster has, such as a dragon having fire breath, or perhaps even henchmen that might be available inside the structure that, the crime boss can ring a bell and all of a sudden 4 thugs just materialize out of various doorways around you guys. Those are great examples of active encounter elements. And personally, I would find a blend of both, because every monster should have something that's going to be actively harassing your party, as well as having things that are passively harassing your party, such as the terrain being more difficult for creatures that aren't made for it, or things like perhaps there's reduced visibility, or even if there's traps and things like that just exist within the space. Those are all great examples of passive encounter elements that you can add in to threaten your party a little bit more without necessarily boosting up the power of your monsters. I find that keeping those two things, as you're crafting the encounter, it's important to keep those two things kind of together. But then when you're actually thinking about the monster itself, you want to separate them out a little more, because maybe you want to use this particular monster block in other places, in which case they're not going to have the advantage of ringing a bell and having a ton of dudes materialize, unless it's literally a magic bell of materializing dudes.
Now there's a nice magical item that we can come up with.
It's D&D, man. Your imagination's the only real limit.
Mm-hmm.
All right. When you're going to go and design the fight, I've got a few different things that you want to pay attention to. You want to know why it's going to fight. So if it's a beast or something like that, maybe it's hungry. Maybe you're intruding on its territory. Maybe it's lost and is going to be extra defensive because it's lost and it knows that it's, in danger. It could be something like a boss, like a big bad evil guy, having some sort of motivation, such as like, oh, the party slayed like my cousin in the neighboring county, and so I need to bring them down. When you make those decisions, that informs for you when the party interacts with that monster, what they can expect as far as, is it going to attack them outright, or do they need to do something to set it off before it starts combat? And though that's one of the most important steps, which is why I put it first, because if you don't know that, then you don't know what your encounter is going to start out looking like. Next, you want to figure out how it's going to fight. Is it going to spit acid? Is it going to throw knives? Is it going to spit acid knives? Like, all of these things are important questions to be asking yourself, because once you go to figure out what is this fight going to look like, how is this going to affect my player characters, you want to be playing off of their weaknesses and strengths in such a way that the monster itself will not only be a threat, but will be a threat that feels more designed for them. Next, you need to know if it's going to die fighting. I have a pretty solid rule that most sentient creatures, especially people that have society and things like that, they're not really interested in dying. They're mostly fighting for a reason, such as protecting their homes. If it looks like they're going to die, they would sooner surrender, unless surrender is not an option, or if surrender means something worse for them than death. Like, if you're going to take their entire way of life from them, they may fight to the death just because you're going to threaten their way of life. But if it's, say, a beast or something like that, maybe it takes a couple of hits and runs. Maybe it's a short encounter because it wants the drop on them, and it not having the drop on them is going to be like, well, maybe I'll try this again 4 more miles down the traveling highway. And then finally, what is it fighting for? This is where you determine those things, like the villager who is defending their village, and really they want the party to leave. Well, that for you is going to indicate if your party decides to make another decision, such as halfway through the fight trying to negotiate, or halfway through the fight they decide to flee. Is that villager really going to come out of their house and chase the party down the road throwing spears at them? Probably not, because the villager just wanted them gone. The villager just wants to defend. If you can determine all of those 4 questions, then you'll know exactly how your monster is going to behave once combat starts looking like it's going to come around. And I do a lot of this rule keeping for my NPCs as well, because players will throw you curveballs. NPCs that I never thought would be in combat end up in combat. Which, when you're making a monster, you want to make that monster a credible threat to your party. If you're throwing goons at them as basically the big bad evil guy is throwing his cannon fodder at you to slow you down, not only is that frustrating for you, because you're like, okay, this should probably take them like 2 or 3 rounds of combat, and then either everyone hits so hard that it all dies instantly, or everyone's missing, and what should have been a 2 or 3 round of combat encounter turns into a 20 round of combat. Oh God, we almost party wiped. You want it to be that credible threat right off the bat, so that your players, not just your player characters, but your players don't feel like you're wasting their time. You want it to be a situation where they're on the ropes. They're not necessarily going to die, but they know that if they aren't careful, that you will absolutely bring the hammer down on them.
Yeah, that's an issue I have designing encounters for higher levels, especially. Because you get past like level 7, level 8, and 5e, and monks start getting crazy abilities, and you have this enemy that you think is going to be a real beast, but then you get somebody with like 8 attacks per turn and just tearing them down.
Yeah, and it's tough to decide how many monsters am I going to throw at this group. What are going to be my active encounter elements? Mm-hmm. Because especially once you start getting into higher levels, it's like, well, 3 of my player characters can cast Fireball.
Right.
Do I really want to put 5 monsters in this encounter? They're conveniently spread very far apart, so you can't get them all at once. And they're like, okay, well, the fighter rushes in to kind of draw them all to one point. They're all archers now.
Wait a minute. I thought they were gelatinous cubes.
The gelatinous cubes are firing acid bolts.
They're spitting acid knives.
The acid knives, no. All right. Moving from there, you need to be ready to kill your darlings, or more importantly, let your players kill your darlings. Because when it comes right down to it, no matter how cool the monster you craft is, it's still a monster, and your players are probably still going to want it dead or on their side. And either way, you're going to need to be ready to end its life somehow or another. So first, you want to figure out what your end game is for this monster. Is it something that's just an encounter to kind of build out the world a little bit, to make the players see what a dangerous area this jungle on the eastern side of the continent is, why people say that adventurers go there but most never come back, like those sorts of things? Is it just to establish a sense of danger, or is it there to illustrate something a little more? Is it there to make the players feel like jerks when they find out that the roving band of mercenaries they just killed because they had a captive? It turns out the captive is actually an evil wizard, and they just killed basically another party of adventurers because they didn't stop to ask questions. Like, what is your end game for this monster? Is going to help you make a lot of decisions about what that encounter winds up looking like as it's coming to its tail end. How those characters are going to interact, how those monsters are going to interact with your characters. Part of that is figuring out how important that monster is to your narrative and to your world. If it's something that's going to be integrally important, then you need to make the encounter feel just as important. It's not really satisfying to have what's supposed to be big bad evil guy show up in the second adventure and then have to run away because people keep hitting him with arrows and acid knives and other things. And he's just losing health way too quickly. Mm-hmm. Which brings me to my next point. If you are going to put a monster into the field of play, then you need to be ready to have that moment where, I'm sure we've all seen it in films and other media, where the plucky young adventurers have finally found the big evil villain in his moment of triumph. He's holding aloft the magic doodad and saying, "Now my power is complete. You'll never defeat me." And then 3 minutes later is yelling, "No, this is impossible." You don't want to be the person saying that behind the DM screen. Because if you're saying that, then that means that the next 3 arcs of your adventure, wherein that monster was supposed to be, the big bad evil guy, that's going to need some rewriting.
Josh, I have a question.
Yes.
Related to that. How do you feel about letting the narrative supersede the stats in those kind of situations? Because I know I've run games where maybe the party they were a little bit more powerful than I was expecting, or they got a little bit more creative than I was expecting, and they were able to really put a wallop on somebody who was supposed to reappear later as the big evil person. But I just sort of like mentally adjusted that person's stats, knowing that it would serve a greater narrative purpose later.
I think so. There's a couple of sides to this. Thing number one is that if you're going to be putting a monster like this into play and you want it to be a big, brutal fight, and you've completely underestimated the craftiness of your player characters, then you either need to adjust the encounter, as you're saying, and make it a little more intense that way, or you need to accept the fact that that monster just wasn't as bad of a dude as they thought he was. Which is my next point: always have a backup, because all of us inevitably will ignore that third bullet point and put a big bad evil guy into the adventure because the party's only level 1. They're not going to be able to kill this level 6 wizard. He's way too powerful. Oh God, they just did 3 crits in a row, and he just crit fumbled twice in a row, and I don't know. That wasn't that wasn't the big bad evil guy. That was just a lieutenant. That's all that was. Don't you all worry about that. My plot is still fully intact. No one sweat it. Because your players don't know well, they shouldn't, I should say, know exactly what is on your notebook, because then you can easily pass off the old, oh, the big bad evil guy. He was a lieutenant of a bigger, badder evil guy.
Eviler guy.
Congratulations, you are now in a shonen anime. Welcome to Dragon Ball Z, the Dungeons and Dragons edition. You have to be ready for those moments, because all of us really like the narrative scene, I think, where the big bad evil guy kind of pops out and is like, aha, I'll show all of you, and then vanishes in a cloud of smoke, and it's very mysterious and he's very threatening. But if they're like, I'm going to hit him, you're like, no, not right now. No, please. I'm going to hit him. Oh, that's a crit 20. Come on, guys. You have to be prepared for that possibility if you're going to put a monster into play. And as such, I like to have a couple of backup plans. Sometimes it's that the bad guy isn't as bad as you thought he was. There's actually a worse guy behind him. Sometimes it's that the monster that you're looking at is part of a race of monsters, and now you've induced their ire by killing the one. You have brought about the wrath of the many.
Hey Josh, we've got about 9 minutes left. I just want to make sure we're still on track.
I think so. Yeah, we should only have a couple slides left.
Okay.
So yeah, but basically my point being, having that backup plan for if you're going to put a monster into play and you're not ready for it to die, knowing that there's the possibility it might die anyway, and kind of penciling something in the background, I think that'll put you in a good position for when you make that decision, narratively or otherwise, so that your players can still have that success. I know I've heard from people that they're like, oh, I just made that dude unkillable for that encounter. But the problem is, people pay attention to stuff like that. If they go, we dealt 300 plus damage to this guy who I thought was only a level 6 wizard, but if he has that much HP, then I don't even know. Like, how are we supposed to fight this? You're really disheartening your players by basically telling them that their actions are less important than the narrative that you came up with, which is kind of unfair because it's a collaborative storytelling game. Like, you are doing the bulk of the work by coming up with everything they're going up against, but they get to have their chance to shine too. Which is kind of my next point, which is plausible victorability, which I think victorability is a word maybe that Alon made up.
I think it is. I was going to ask you about that.
He helped me spruce this bad boy up because I'm not terribly good at any kind of design, much less graphic or otherwise. You want to make the fight winnable. When you do finally put your party up against that monster, big bad evil guy or otherwise, it needs to be something that they can win. I have been guilty of a couple of times in the past coming up with encounters that the party can't win because they're not allowed to. My narrative's that important. And the sheer fact of the matter is, based on the reaction I had from everyone at the table, I did not feel good about those encounters because I basically took player agency off the table so that they couldn't have what they wanted to have. If you're going to make a fight, make it something that the party can win, even if it's only through like craftiness or only through getting some good rolls or things like that. And make it so that they can survive if they really want to. And part of that is making sure that as you're designing your encounter, talk to other DMs, talk to other people that you know run games that are not currently in your party, and kind of troubleshoot with them the concept that you've got and where you're going with it. So the final panel that I've got, I believe. Yeah. Oh no, I've got two more. Oh,
yeah, that's why I was like, hurry.
All right. So when you're designing the fight, hubris is for mortals. Recognize your own weaknesses and try to do things to fill in those gaps. Maybe you're not super great at maps. Maybe you're not super great at keeping track of things. Use paper and pencil. That's what they're there for. Use notes. Take ample notes about everything. If your monster's not being threatening enough or is being too threatening, don't be afraid to adjust things mid-fight. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the game for me personally. If your monster goes down way, way too fast, then your party is going to be like, well, that was kind of disappointing. We were all geared up for this. We cast all of our buff spells. We wasted so many magic items.
That was my plan all
along. When you're looking back at the fight, see if you can determine if you got what you wanted out of that fight. And if you didn't, what you might have been able to do differently so that you could have. And see if the party got what they wanted out of that fight. And if they didn't, what you might be able to do differently so that their satisfaction can also be a little higher. And post-fight is also a great time to talk to other DMs, because I know for me personally, there's been a lot of instances where I go, I had this idea and I thought I implemented it really well, but here's what wound up happening. And they'll be like, well, did you tell them that there was a slot in the door that you could put the bauble into so that it would unlock the door? And I was like, I did not. And they're like, well, maybe that's the thing you need for the future. I'm not great at puzzles. If you didn't catch that on that story. So that covers my presentation. These are all of our links to things. We've got a Discord, we've got an Instagram, a Facebook, our own Twitch, which we are currently rehosting this very stream on. Mm-hmm. Hello, Growling Goblin Studios fans.
Hello.
And then we've also got our own actual play podcast that is DM'd by Alex Smith of Alpha Comics and Games here in Willow Lawn in Richmond, Virginia. And they do all kinds of D&D stuff. They do a lot of Magic the Gathering stuff. Right now, with everything being like it is, they're doing curbside pickup as well as online ordering. So if you are a comics fan or if you are a gaming fan, give them a look, because they're really cool and they do a lot of really cool community stuff with us.
And also missing from this list is our Patreon.
Let me make sure that's not on. Nope, that's right back to the top.
Yeah, patreon.com/goblins growlers. We create original adventure content. We have a variety of tiers. It's very cool. It helps support us in creating, building inclusive gaming communities and creating original content for people.
Yeah. So if you liked everything that you saw here today, definitely check us out in some of these other places.
Yeah, join our Discord especially. There's a lot of really good conversation that goes on there.
Yeah, I didn't see anything in the way of questions except for whether or not there was free pastrami at the New York Deli game. So if you have questions or considerations, or you just wanted to give either of us some notes, I am punning our gaffis on our Discord right now. And Brandon, I believe you are the Fresh Prince of Tel-Air. Or
no, I changed it. I'm Tennessee Butler now.
Oh yes, Tennessee Butler. Oh my word.
Yeah.
Definitely, if you enjoy our goofy, rambling stylings, then check out our podcast, Good for a Roll, because there's a lot of that in there. And it's basically just a group of friends having a ton of fun in this really expansive and beautiful world that Alex has created.
Yeah. And tomorrow, I think at 5:15, some of us will be back for live plays going on in the evening.
That is correct. Alon and Phil and some special guests that Alon has put together will be back running a one-shot adventure tomorrow at 5:15.
All right. And also, right now, we've got, for this weekend, we've got a special free shipping deal for the continental United States going on at our Big Cartel store, goblinsandgrowlers.bigcartel.com. If you go there and put in the discount code crowd control, it'll be free shipping for you, as long as you're not in Alaska, Hawaii, or another country.
And then we're still willing to ship it. It's just going to cost you something.
Yeah.